colleagues, and distinguished guests. I am Anis Al Hroub. I'm associate professor at the American University of Beirut, and I am a member in the executive committee at the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children. It's my pleasure and my honor that I stand before you today as your moderator for this distinguished session at the World Council for Gifted and Talented Conference. We are privileged to have with us an eminent scholar and expert in the field of education psychology, Professor Li-fang Zhang. Professor Zhang is a renowned figure in the academic world, serving as a professor of educational psychology at the University of Hong Kong. She is currently the chair of the university's Human Research Ethics Committee. She serves as the Associate Dean for Research Higher Degrees between 2007 and 2010, and as the head of the Division of Learning, Development, and Diversity between 2013 and 2019. Her expertise expands various domains, including intellectual styles, giftedness, creativity, student development in higher education, and the academic profession. One of her most notable contributions is the groundbreaking threefold model of intellectual styles, which has significant advance and understanding of how individuals process information. Her influential monographs and handbooks on intellectual styles have earned her recognition in the academic community. With over 2 decades of experience in scholarly research, Professor Zhang has authored and co-authored more than 140 peer-reviewed journal articles and dozens of academic books and book chapters, solidifying her position as a leading authority in the field. Notably, her award-winning monographs, The Malleability of Intellectual Styles and the Nature of the Intellectual Styles, have left a profound impact on the education research landscape. In addition to her impressive scholarly achievements, Professor Zhang is an accomplished editor, holding an esteemed position of editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Education Psychology. She also serves as a consulting editor of the Journal of Education Psychology and an associate editor of the Education Psychology, showcasing her commitment to advancing the field through academic publishing. Today, Professor Zhang will share her insights on acknowledging creativity generating intellectual styles for gifted education. Her presentation promises to be thought-provoking, shedding light on how we can better nurture and support gifted students through understanding their unique cognitive approaches. Let us warmly welcome Professor Li Zhang and eagerly participate the wealth of knowledge and wisdom she can impart upon us today. Welcome, Dr. Zhang, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Professor Arul, for such a generous introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying on for this talk. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank members of the organizing committee of this conference for your very kind invitation to give this talk, and for all the kind of thoughtful arrangements that you have made. My very special thanks go to Dr. Clark for all the very patient and effective communication with me over the past 10 months. It is indeed my great honor to speak at this conference. The title of my talk today is Acknowledging Creativity Generating Intellectual Styles for Gifted Education. It is inspired by a chapter that I contributed to an edited book entitled Conceptions of Giftedness and Talented, edited by Professors Stenberg and Ambrose. Of course, there are many different ways of conceptualizing the concept of giftedness. But as an educational psychologist and as someone who has devoted a significant part of my career to the understanding of the function of intellectual styles in human learning and performance. And based on a thorough review of the literature, I came to the conclusion that giftedness can be conceptualized as the propensity for using creativity generating intellectual styles. So by the end of the talk, my hope is that you would agree with me on the importance of acknowledging creativity generating intellectual styles as a key factor in gifted education. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to take you through this. First, I'd like to define the construct of intellectual styles. Secondly, I will give you a brief introduction of the field of intellectual styles. Particularly, I will focus on two controversial issues on the nature of intellectual styles. And then I will move on to the main focus of this talk, and that is to present to you two types of research evidence that formed as the basis for my conceptualization of giftedness. First, that will be giftedness gifted students are more likely to use creativity generating intellectual styles. Secondly, creativity generating intellectual styles are closely associated with attributes that are commonly recognized in the gifted. Somewhere along the line of presenting those two types of research evidence, I will put on two caveats. The first concerns the notion of successful intellectual styles, and the second one concerns the functions of intellectual styles in institutional performance. I will then briefly mention the notion of the malleability of intellectual styles. In concluding this talk, I will discuss briefly the implications of the findings I'll be presenting for educating gifted students and indeed their peers in the general population. I will particularly put a focus on what I call the RUN model. The RUN stands for recognizing, accommodating, and nurturing particular styles that I'll be presenting. I'm trying to figure out technology here. Now, intellectual styles. Well, as you know, the concept of styles is used in many domains of our lives. Styles of clothing, painting, writing, and indeed the styles of organizing a conference such as this. But an intellectual style refers to people's preferred ways of using the abilities that they have. Notice that I'm using the term intellectual style in a general sense to refer to the meanings or all the meanings of 70 plus some style constructs that are documented in the literature concerning styles. But the main distinction of styles from abilities is that while abilities refer to what we can do, styles refer to our preferences as for how to do what we do. But then you might be thinking, what kind of phenomena that styles can help us to explain? What styles can help us to explain those phenomena or individual differences that cannot be totally accounted for by such variables as abilities or personalities, variables that we traditionally rely on in explaining individual differences in human learning and performance. Say, for example, on the screen, there are some questions that these style, the notion of style can help to explain. Say, for example, how is it possible for the same student to fail a multiple choice test, but at the same time to excel on an individual project? Why do gifted students tend to feel bored in class? How is it possible that during the COVID-19 pandemic, or at normal times, for that matter, some students benefit tremendously from online education, but others suffer through it? And finally, in business setting, how is it possible for the same business CEO to do a lousy job in leading one organization, but to prove him or herself a great asset in having another. So before I show you that intellectual styles do have such a magical power, I will say a few words about the field of intellectual styles. The field of intellectual styles has a history of 8 decades of research, but until recently, it had been constantly struggling with its identity due to several major challenges. One such challenge is presented by several controversial issues concerning the nature of intellectual styles. Up on the screen, I put on 2 controversial issues because these are the 2 issues that are the most relevant to this talk. One concerns style malleability and the other concerns style value. Style malleability concerns the question, the classic debate, I should say, over nature versus nurture. Put it simply, can we change our styles, or were we born with certain styles that will remain static throughout our lives? The other issue is style value. Style value concerns whether some styles are more adaptive than others. Put it simply, are there good styles or bad styles? Well, over the years, many scholars have been trying to understand these 2 issues as it relates to these 2 controversial issues. And in this process, several scholars have been trying to bring order to the field by inventing or constructing integrative models. I want to mention the one, oh, sorry. Am I still on? Philip, I pressed the wrong button, I think. Sorry. Oh, I pressed the wrong button, I'm sorry. Can I get this back? Can I get this screen back? And then, okay. I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I want to mention the model that was constructed by Professor Stenberg and myself 18 years ago, because this is the only model in the field till today that has explicitly addressed 3 controversial issues on the nature of intellectual styles. I mentioned 2 now, that is style malleability and style value. The third main issue I'll just briefly mention concerns style overlap, and that is, are styles distinct constructs? Or are they really similar constructs that we just give them different style labels? Well, according to our threefold model of intellectual styles are essentially value-laden, they are malleable, and they overlap highly across theories. Moreover, based on our conceptualization of the field in the work and empirical evidence, we classified all styles into 3 types. That is type 1, type 2, type 3. I want to call your attention particularly to the first 2 types of styles, because those are the 2 that I'll be focusing on in the rest of the talk. So type 1 styles are what we call creativity generating styles. That is in the title of my talk. And they communicate higher levels of cognitive complexity. These are the styles that are considered to be more adaptive or desirable because they have been empirically proven to be consistently associated with more desirable attributes. I will show you some research evidence in a few slides away, but let me go through this one first. So type 2 styles are norm-favoring, and they tend to communicate lower levels of cognitive complexity. They are considered more maladaptive or undesirable because they have been consistently, or at least most of the time, associated with maladaptive human attributes and outcomes. Type 3 styles is not our focus, but I just want to say they could manifest characteristics of either type 1 or type 2 styles, depending on the stylistic demands of specific tasks. The adaptivity of type 3 styles is variable because the ways in which they are associated with other human attributes and outcomes have been largely inconsistent. So before I move on to the focus of today's talk, that is to present evidence for my conception of giftedness, I just want to show you one slide that summarizes the main features of the empirical work in my field. While research on styles has been conducted in different parts of the world, but there is a general lack of studies that is conducted in economically disadvantaged cultural contexts. Diverse populations, academic and non-academic, have served as the targets of this research. At the same time, a wide range of style constructs and other constructs in psychology and other relevant constructs in other fields such as in education and business have been serving as the theoretical foundation of this research. In terms of research design, the majority of the studies are cross-sectional, but there is a decent number of studies that are longitudinal and experimental with control and treatment group. Finally, in terms of the research tools that we use, the majority of the studies use self-report tests. But again, there's a great amount of studies that use tests of maximal performance, classroom observation, interviews, and diverse interventions, ranging from teacher training and classroom instruction to cognitive modeling, from meditation to musical rhythm training, and from stress management to medication. So finally, or at last, it's in the middle of the talk still. Let me move on to the focus of this talk, and that is to present to you two types of research evidence that serve as the foundation for my conception of giftedness as a propensity for using creativity generating styles. The first type of research evidence concerns the intellectual styles of the gifted, and the second one concerns the association between creativity generating intellectual styles. Remember, sometimes I'll use type 1 styles, so those two are alternative terms. And attributes deemed essential to giftedness are considered actually by some of the prominent scholars in the field of giftedness. I'm going to show you some citations later on. But I do apologize for not including citations in this and most other slides. But for those of you who are interested, I'd be happy to email you the relevant sources after this conference. Now, concerning the first type of research evidence, intellectual styles of the gifted. During my work, in the process of my work, over the chapter that I mentioned earlier, which is I contribute to the edited book, Conception of Giftedness and Talented, I came across a decent number of studies that involved gifted students and utilized five of the 10 style models that I included in our threefold model of intellectual styles. These include personality styles as measured by the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, perceptual styles as measured by diverse forms or several forms of embedded figures test. Some of you might be familiar with this. And then conceptual tempo as measured by different forms of matching familiar figures test. Career personality styles as measured by the self-directed search. And finally, thinking styles as measured by thinking styles inventory. Well, in terms of cultural context, the studies based on the first three styles I listed up there were all conducted in the United States. And studies based on the last two cell constructs were conducted in Germany, Iran, and South Korea. So you might say immediately that in terms of the scope of the study regarding cultural context, the study is rather limited. So I am going to come back to address this limitation later on. The participants for this research are diverse, including students that are identified as intellectually gifted based on their intelligence test scores and/or GPAs, gifted readers, students who study in schools for the gifted, students studying in schools focusing on cultivating high-quality intellects in math and sciences, and those students who participate in programs for the academically talented or talented in other specific domains. So the age and educational backgrounds of these students or gifted individuals varied very widely, actually, ranging from 29-month-old preschoolers to 20-year-old university students. Well, in order to identify the key characteristics of these gifted individuals, 3 methods of comparison are used. The first one focuses solely on gifted individuals, and their scores on tests of intellectual styles are compared with established norms that is established for the general population. The second method compared gifted individuals with non-gifted individuals. Notice that I put non-gifted in quotation because I believe that all students are gifted in their own unique ways. Well, the third type of comparison involved 3 types of students. Those are students selected for gifted programs, students identified as gifted but ultimately not selected, as well as students who are not recognized as gifted. Well, here's the key finding. The main finding is that gifted students are more likely to report using creativity generating, also known as type 1 intellectual styles. Specifically, gifted students tend to score higher on the intuitive and perceiving dimensions of the MBTI as opposed to sensing and judging. They tend to score higher on field independence rather than field dependent in their perceptual style. They tend to be more reflective rather than impulsive on their cognitive style. They tend to score higher on all the 5 type 1 thinking styles. We don't have time to define here. Again, for those of you who are interested, I can always send you more information. And finally, gifted students tend to have stronger artistic and investigative career personality styles. Well, given the long history of research on styles, one must say, and I do admit, that the amount of research that involve gifted students, particularly those specifically focusing on gifted students, is rather small. And in addition to the cultural limitations that I mentioned earlier in terms of the 5 style models where they have been studied, there are other limitations to be considered. Say, for example, with the exception of studies on personality styles, the examination of gifted individuals based on the other 4 style models has been less systematic. Well, given these limitations, some might question the validity or credibility of my conception of giftedness as a propensity to use creativity generating intellectual styles. But I would argue that for at least 3 reasons, there are 3 good reasons for asserting its defensibility with confidence. First, the quality of the existing studies is robust. Say, for example, some studies involved thousands of students studying across over 100 schools. Secondly, despite the fact that they are based on different style constructs, and irrespective of the fact that the data sets across all those studies are gathered from different age groups and different cultural contexts, the existing studies have yielded consistent findings. And finally, just to ensure the validity of my conception of giftedness, I went beyond the literature involving gifted students. And this brings me to the second type of research evidence on which my conception of giftedness is based. Well, in particular, I investigated studies that explore studies on the relationship between intellectual styles and other human attributes and constructs. So unsurprisingly, the literature revealed a clear link between styles that foster creativity, and that is type 1 styles, and attributes that are adaptive. For example, or I'd say I listed most of these. These include, for example, cognitive attributes, such as metacognition. I think it's important here to list the citation here, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, as well as non-cognitive attributes, such as thirst for knowledge, achievement motivation to approach success, and advanced epistemological and psychosocial development. Notice that these are some of the attributes that are considered essential to giftedness by some of the most prominent, as I listed here in these slides, scholars in the field of giftedness. In fact, a significant portion of this literature has been reviewed in my book entitled The Value of Intellectual Styles, published back in 2017 by Cambridge University Press. Particularly, those chapters are highlighted in red color in this slide. So when I received the invitation to write a chapter for Professor Stenberg and Ambrose, I did a further research of the literature because the book was published in 2017. So I made sure I covered the literature starting from 2016 to 2020. The chapter was published in 2021. Anyway, so further research or further exploration of the literature confirmed my earlier conclusion in terms of the association between type 1 intellectual styles and favorable attributes and outcomes. So now let me present the second type of research evidence. Well, specifically concerning styles and cognitive attributes, those students who report using type 1 styles more often tend to score higher on intelligence and ability, or they demonstrate these attributes. They tend to think more critically and more creatively. They tend to display higher level of cognitive complexity. They are more reflective about their learning, and they show significantly more signs of effective brain functioning. Again, each statement I'm making is a broad statement. Please be assured that each of these statements is result that has been obtained from multiple studies, and they are statistically significant. Well, in terms of the relationship between styles and non-cognitive outcomes, those students who report using type 1 styles more often tend to display higher levels of emotional intelligence. They have a better sense of their career goals, a much broader range of career interest, and a stronger career adaptability. They have a clearer sense of who they are and greater sense of social responsibility. And they're engaged in their learning, not because they want to avoid failure, but because they want to achieve success. While the superiority of type 1 styles over type 2 styles has not only been observed among students, but also among teachers, particularly in terms of their teaching and research, teachers and academics actually, in terms of teaching and research behaviors and outcomes. For example, those who score higher on type 1 teaching styles tend to facilitate conceptual change among their students and engage in more innovative research agendas. They tend to show stronger need for cognition, that is a thirst for knowledge, and exhibit more positive teaching emotions. And they display stronger character strengths. They tend to indicate lower levels of occupational stress and express more job satisfaction. Well, based on the research findings that I have presented so far, one might think that intellectual styles can be dichotomized into good ones and bad ones. Well, is that so? Is it really that type 1 styles are always adaptive and that type 2 styles are absolutely maladaptive? Well, the answer has to be a no. Although type 1 styles have always been, or almost always been, showing adaptive attributes, type 2 styles have been at the time being observed to display adaptive attributes. So based on this finding, I must put a caveat on the two set of general research findings that I have presented just now. And that is, in the case of several attributes, positive attributes often requires the use of a wide range of styles, including all three types of styles I mentioned just now, particularly type 1 styles. So this is the case, say, for example, for cognitive development, creativity, critical thinking, and student-centered teaching behaviors. So based on this observation, I coined the term successful intellectual styles back in 2015. Again, I can provide you with relevant citation later on. But at the same time, there is a caveat number 2, and that concerns the functions of intellectual styles in institutional performance. What is it? In practical terms, based on the research findings, we should say that type 1 styles are far superior over type 2 styles. Nevertheless, in reality, type 2 styles are more often rewarded. So the general findings does not quite apply when it comes to institutional performance. In many schools, it is students scoring higher on type 2 styles that achieve higher academic school performance. So the question arises, what type of intellectual styles should schools be encouraging? So for now, let me leave you with that question and just speak very briefly about the issue of style malleability. Well, you might be wondering that where do our styles come from? Can we change them? Responses to those questions would contribute to the debate on the issue of style malleability. While the issue of style malleability is not essential to my conception of giftedness, but it is worth mentioning because nurturing or cultivating particular type of intellectual styles would be pointless if our styles cannot be even changed. So just let me briefly show you 2 slides. So the first slide concerns the heritability of our styles. More than 1 decade ago, that's back in 2009, Professor Gringorenko, way back when at Yale University, did a thorough search of the literature. Actually, she was written a chapter for my book, edited book back then. And she was only able to identify 2 studies that were ever conducted to examine the extent to which our intellectual styles can be changed. Well, the first study, conducted back in 1971, was based on Wittgen's field-dependent, field-independent theory. The finding was pretty disappointing. The heritability estimate was about 0.11, and that is to say only about 11% of our intellectual styles are heritable or can be attributed to genetic factors. While the second study, a study of twins, concerns the genetic etiology of reflective and impulsive styles. But the findings of this one is even more disappointing if you want to argue that styles are heritable, in that the heritability estimate was less than 0. And that is to say, the correlations of the styles for identical twins were higher than those for fraternal twins, when in fact, if you study genetic etiology, it should be it's counterintuitive, it should have been reversed. So given this type of evidence, one has to say, well, there's little evidence that our styles are heritable. So many researchers, myself included, have been spending their career searching for evidence that styles are malleable. Well, in this regard, I published a book back in 2013. So in this book, I reviewed 2 types of research evidence documenting the malleability of intellectual styles. Along the first line of investigation, there are actually many studies showing that styles could differ based on socialization factors. Because of space limit, and I want to focus on 4 individual factors or socialization factors. So ended up reviewing style differences based on culture, gender, academic discipline, and occupation. Because of time, I'm not going to present any research evidence. And also on the second line of investigation is on experimental studies that involve styles training actually. But again, because of time, our focus is presenting my argument that styles are malleable. Otherwise, we don't have to talk about changing people's styles, including gifted student style. So let me draw 3 conclusions then. So based on the research findings I have presented so far, these are the 3 conclusions. So first, gifted individuals are more likely to use type 1 intellectual styles. That is the first conclusion. And also the first type of research evidence based on which I base on my conceptualization of giftedness. Secondly, type 1 styles are closely associated with cognitive and non-cognitive attributes essential to giftedness. And thirdly, I didn't present much, but I want to assure you, styles can be developed. And I would like to, at this point, also bring you back to those 2 caveats that I presented just now. First of all, the positive development of some of the attributes, I mentioned the creativity, critical thinking, and so forth, call for successful intellectual styles. And that is a diverse or wide repertoire of styles, including all 3 types of styles, with type 1 styles being the primary ones and the other 2 types being the secondary ones. So that is the first caveat. The second caveat is that in many schools, actually in organizations, business settings as well, type 1 styles are often not rewarded in terms of institutional performance, be that school grades or promotion, what have you. So those are the 2 caveats. Unfortunately, those 2 caveats present 2 paradoxes that we cannot ignore. First of all, gifted students, much like their peers in the general population, have diverse intellectual styles, and yet in most schools, not all styles are equally valued. And indeed, sometimes type 1 creativity generating styles can be penalized. And secondly, gifted students are more likely to use type 1 intellectual styles that are closely associated with attributes that are essential to giftedness. And paradoxically, again, in many schools, type 2 styles tend to be rewarded in terms of school grades. So those are two paradoxes. So what can we do to deal with those two paradoxes? And specifically, what can schools do, or what measures can we take to ensure that gifted students receive a high quality education? So that will lead me to presenting some of the implications of the research findings for educating gifted students and indeed their peers in the general population. Well, based on the research findings I have presented, and actually much more that we don't have time for today, I would argue that a key factor in providing a high quality education for gifted students and their peers for that matter is to foster successful intellectual styles. Again, that is a wide range of styles, particularly type 1 styles. Then the next logical question is, what can we do exactly to foster successful intellectual styles? Well, based on the research findings, this go back to the title. By the way, I changed my title because the word nurturing is only one way of acknowledging. So I changed the title into acknowledging to cover three terms. That is recognizing the concept of intellectual styles. Secondly, to accommodate diverse intellectual styles. And thirdly, to nurture creativity generating intellectual styles. And I'm looking at the time. So these concerns all parties at any schools, in particular students, school teachers, student development educators, that is school counselors or whoever, non-teaching staff, and also, indeed, equally importantly, school senior management team. So let me show you the last few slides on some of these implications. So for students, one of the key implications of the knowledge style for them is to become aware of the concept of style. An awareness of the concept of style is particularly important for students' self-esteem and their learning motivation. Very often, low performers, including, by the way, underachieving gifted students, tend to attribute their poor school performance to their low abilities or anything that is wrong with them. So with an understanding not only their own intellectual styles, but their teachers' intellectual styles do matter in their school performance. Students, including gifted students, may start reflecting and developing more adaptive attributes to their successes and failures. So instead of blaming themselves for their bad performance or feeling bad about themselves, they could start exploring ways of either adapting to or shaping their learning environment. So equally importantly, an awareness of the diversity of intellectual styles should enable gifted students to become more tolerant of individual differences in many different ways. As we all know, one of the key challenges for gifted students is their lack of sense of integration with their peers. So an awareness of the concept style should be able to help them. Well, for teachers, there are two types of main types of implications. The first type is the keyword accommodate, the A in the RAND model. That is to allow for diverse styles. And this can be done by instructing and assessing diverse styles. And this can be also done by changing attributions about their students' success and failures. So what does that mean? Well, students, low performers, are not the only one who tend to attribute their success and failures to their low performance, but their teachers as well. They subtly, or a lot of times, not so subtly, communicate the same idea to the student that they perform poorly because they're not able to, they're not capable of their learning. So it also has implications for teachers to change their attribution of their students' success and failures. And a final example is in terms of teachers showing sensitivity to style differences based on some of the personal and environmental factors on differences. And actually, there are many, many factors, socialization factors that can affect student styles. Well, the second type of implication for teachers is in terms of nurturing type 1 intellectual styles or creativity generating intellectual styles. And this can be done, first of all, by role modeling creative thinking and behaviors. Because styles are socialized, they can certainly be learned. So by observing and emulating adults, in this case teachers, to role model creative thinking and behaviors, students, including gifted students, can actually cultivate or develop their own creative thinking and behaviors. And this can also be done by allowing for mistakes and encouraging sensible risk-taking from the teachers. While students must be allowed to make mistakes, and they must take risks, because a lot of creative behaviors and outcomes are actually the result of experimenting through trial and error over a relatively long period of time. And the final example is, again, going back to teaching and assessment. We as teachers can teach and assess for creative thinking styles and behaviors. And this is in terms of student development educators. Well, because just now I presented research findings that intellectual style can also contribute to student developmental outcomes. Well, student development educators can also make a difference by fostering successful intellectual styles. The first, say for example, is to use diverse styles to work with students so that students' diverse needs can be accommodated. And secondly, they can design and implement programs that aim at enabling their students to have a better understanding or appreciation of diverse values, opinions, or ways of doing things. For the last example, I focus on the nurturing. So the last, in terms of encouraging students, well, students often approach school counselors for decision makings, especially their non-academic kind of decision making. So school counselors can encourage students to be more thoughtful, say for example, in their decision making, and therefore stimulating their complex thinking. So finally, none of those measures can be implemented effectively without being done systematically, beginning with school senior management teams. And that is to say, in order to cultivate diverse intellectual styles among students, school senior managers, including, of course, school principals, as well as the team who work with him or her, first, they need to encourage teachers and student development educators to develop their own diverse styles. And secondly, they can also make a difference in terms of enhance the quality of gifted education and more broadly, general education by fostering or by encouraging type 1 intellectual styles among all parties. So I think I will stop here. Those of you who are interested, those are some of the books I have published over the years. I recommend those, of course, I'll provide you with the citations if you're interested later on. I recommend those books not only because they are mine, but mainly because they have a broad coverage and they have been done systematically. So I recommend them. Of course, a lot of work also done by my colleagues. I can introduce you to the field if you like. So I just want to thank you finally for the privilege of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for this very informative and research-based presentation. That's really important for us to know about, especially that you're coming, and you've done some work, which is, I think, from the Far East, Hong Kong. So that's really a very good contribution to the field of education. Thank you very much. So it's the time now to take some questions. I see in the box here some questions, starting with the first one. It's This is Noor Eva from Indonesia. How many kinds of intellectual styles and how to know that? I think maybe you already explained that. I don't know if you need to elaborate a bit or you feel that's enough for what you presented.
Thank you, Professor Aru, for that opportunity. Actually, Eva, I thank you very much for your question. I saw your question from the very beginning before my talk because I was stuck with other things I didn't respond. So you might know by now there are three types of intellectual styles. But a fair question a lot of people ask me is, okay, you said there are three types of intellectual styles that you only focus on type 1 and type 2 cells. Where did type 3 go? Well, isn't that type 3 because you said it can demonstrate either type 1 or type 2 cells? But does that mean that they are more flexible? Does that mean that they are more adaptive? So the answer is actually no. They look like they are more adaptive because their association with other styles have been largely inconsistent as when I did my presentation. Sometimes they exhibit adaptive attribute, other times they exhibit maladaptive attributes. Say, for example, let me give you an example. One of the typical type 3 styles is, say, for example, in systemic theory on thinking styles, there's one pair of style called internal styles and external styles. Let's focus on internal style. Internal style concerns a preference that we prefer to work alone. But when we work alone, we can work very creatively. So in that sense, we are exhibiting type 1 styles. But we can also work very ineffectively in terms of working in a type 2 style way. That would be perhaps if you talk about some of the attributes that I presented, like creativity, creative thinking, or student developmental outcomes, you might exhibit type 2 style. So that would be maladaptive. So in other words, even though type 3 styles can manifest either type 1 or type 2 styles, it doesn't mean it is more adaptive. I don't know if that is a fair explanation, if that explains. That is one of the very frequent questions that I receive when I do talks like this. Well, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very
Ian.
Yes, another question, or maybe two questions. The first one by Shirley Mediansky, giving evidence that styles can be influenced through socialization and training. How can we accurately identify gifted children? I think maybe the second question by Susan Dikakis. Also, she's asking about your opinion of the most useful test for identifying creative gifted students. So both maybe about how to identify gifted children through your own theory and model.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really like that question too. Well, the research evidence I presented here basically saying that gifted students tend to exhibit type 1 styles. But then you may argue them, well, they're already identified as gifted students, then why should we continue to develop their type 1 thinking styles? What the question or the problem here is that a lot of our gifted students, unfortunately, they are, I'd say, skipped over. They are ignored. They don't have higher achievement. They can be passed over in the selecting process. even though they have type 1 thinking styles or type 1 intellectual styles, it is the ones who are exhibiting, there is, by the way, a high correlation between type 1 intellectual styles and say things that are presented on their IQ scores or intelligence scores. Of course, IQ is not equivalent to intelligence. IQ is IQ, intelligence is much broader. So you may be able to identify those students who have high intelligence test scores or IQ scores or GPAs. But a lot of students scoring higher on type 1 intellectual styles will be passed over. So in that regard, I would argue that assessing or selecting students by their intellectual styles might be one of the effective ways of selecting gifted students. So actually, I have written about that in the chapter I mentioned.
Great, thank you very
So
much.
that is one additional, it's not the only way, but that's an additional way that we can go about selecting, identifying gifted students. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question by Gary Sanders. The question is saying, does a high type 2 style impede type 1 malleability? In other words, does one need to be low type 2 to have type 1 growth?
Thank you very much. Uh, so put it this way, all intellectual styles can be developed. But then, of course, there's always a so-called glass ceiling or ceiling effect, right? So if you are very, very type 2, and then you are placed in a context whereby your type 1 styles are fostered, then you can develop very quickly and catching up on type 1 style. But you already have a strong tendency for type 1 styles, then of course we can further develop our type 1 styles. Again, there is a ceiling effect. The key word here is cultivation. It is the environment that cultivates. Say, for example, we often find in our field of research that students who are from what I call economically or socially disadvantaged cultural contexts, those students tend to score higher on type 2 styles. But if you put them into a different context, or even the students in the same cultural context, but in different, say, for example, in the past, there's one particular research on kids from different tribal groups in Sierra Leone. So that's what I'd say an economically disadvantaged cultural context. But in different tribes, in one tribe, which is called the Mandis children, they are from very early on age, they are put in a context whereby they take responsibilities, family responsibilities. So they tend to develop type 1 styles. But there's another tribal group known as the Tammany group. In that group, children are highly demanded to be conformative to school teachers, to parents, and they are constantly subject to physical punishment if they don't behave themselves. So if you grew up in those contexts, sure, type 2 styles you'll see most immediately. So it is really the environment that cultivate or affect our styles development.
Thank you. Thank you for this illustrated response. We've got another, actually, people are very interested actually in your presentation. It's obvious.
Yeah,
So,
and I'm happy to receive those questions by email later on. Thank you.
a question by Mr. Hassan Akadanis is about how do we benefit from those styles in mixed classrooms, including gifted and talented students and others?
Actually, the connection here is not very good, Professor Aru. Can you please repeat that question?
Yeah, okay. The question is, how do we benefit from those styles in mixed classrooms, including gifted and talented students?
Oh, perfect. That really hit the key.
Yeah.
Diverse styles. That's one of the three main strategies. That will be the A in the RAN model. So first, we need to recognize that is the A. The second one is to accommodate. So any teacher, I'd say if you teach in diverse styles, and if you assess for diverse style, that would be you give students different assessment schemes using different assessment format so that students, regardless of their styles, can benefit from your instructions. Because we as teachers are instructing in different ways. Students with different styles can benefit more one way or another, rather than just start people with one kind of students with one type of styles benefiting, all students, at least most of students are benefiting. Same thing with assessment. So the key here is diversify the way we teach and assess, and the way we work with students as well. Not only teachers, but also anybody, parents, student development educators, anybody, peers, when you work with students. So that diversity is very, very important, accommodation. Thank you.
Thank you again. A question by Amy Hornman. How do we encourage school systems which seem to really love the predictability and measurability of type 2 styles to place higher value and attention on type 1 style? Do we have any practical tips, summaries that can be shared with the school leadership teams?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question, Professor.
Yeah, so it's saying, yeah, basically that the schools they like and they focus more on type 2 style in in their measurement, in their, I would say, predictability, the academic achievement. So
Right.
what to do actually? What kind of practical tips and summaries we can, let's say, give to the school leadership teams to give higher value or place higher value or attention on type 1 style?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Ru, for relaying that question as well. So as I said, there is actually a very big paradox there. So schools, there is a system, there is institutional performance, I'd say, while you have to assess students in a certain way. So I would say there are students who actually like, say, multiple choice tests. So we do need to give them that opportunity to shine as well. Again, if we could put emphasis on diversifying the way we assess students so that there are some other students who like to use their type 1 styles, then they can use type 1 styles. So assessment, and then in terms of school leaders, in order for teachers, because teachers, they take a lot of instructions. I know, at least in my system, there is a set school curriculum that teachers need to complete. There's a set of assessment schemes they might adhere to. So school leaders can make policies that allow teachers, first of all, we need to begin top. In this, a lot of things being top down is very, very bad. But in this case, if we want to develop type 1 intellectual styles, that has to come top down. If we allow teachers to teach in different ways, particularly focusing on emphasizing creative thinking and behaviors, then students will do it. Students will be emulating. Well, when they get assessment that require them, say, for example, to do a project, to do their research, to choose their own topics, so they will be creative. So it really depends on the school leaders, actually. That really is the bottom of the question as well. Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you very
think,
much, Professor Zhang.
yeah,
I
thank
think
you.
we're at time and we've got too many questions in mind, but I think sadly that we've got limited time. I'm sure that many of the participants will be happy to talk to you in private and to ask many questions. So
Yes.
thank you
Yeah,
again.
thank
And this is, the last session today. So I would like to thank you and thank the participants for attending the first day of the conference. I think we ended this conference happily and with such productive and informative, inspiring, I would say, keynote. I would like to remind everyone of the second day of the conference tomorrow, that it begins at 10 a.m. British Summer Time on August the 6th. So thank you very much for everyone, and thank you again, Professor Zhang.
Thank you, Professor Ru. Thank you, my dear participants. Thank you for your time. Thank you,
It's, ple-
Dr. Clark.
it's
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank
Pleasure.
you. Have a good day and evening or night. Thank you.